Blindness, which I knew nothing about prior to hearing him speak, but it is really a very interesting and cool concept that I'd never heard about. So Mark completed his Master Gardener training in Florida in Alachua County in 2002, and he earned an MS in Horticultural Science from the University of Florida in 2005. From 2000 to 2008, he worked part-time as the Assistant Collection Manager and Extension Botanist at the UF Herbarium. He managed the nursery at the Singapore Botanic Gardens from 2008 to 2011 and was a botanist at the Florida Department of Agriculture from 2011 to 2016. In July 2016, he rejoined the staff of the UF Herbarium to manage the UF IFAS Plant Identification and Information Service. And he has a particular interest in horticultural taxonomy, classification, and identification of cultivated plants. And he is a valuable asset to anybody that works in the counties in the state of Florida. So thanks for joining us today, Mark, and we're ready to get started.
Okie doke. Thank you, Ashley and Anne, for inviting me to speak with you today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. This is a topic which, quite honestly, I had heard of, but knew very little about. And once I started diving into the literature, not only do I find it fascinating, but incredibly relevant to what we do in extension. So my topic today is plant blindness. What is it and what can we do about it? The theory of plant blindness was developed by the late James Wandersee, who was at Louisiana State University, and a doctoral student of his, Elizabeth Schussler, who is now on the faculty at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And their first publication on this, I believe, was in 1998. And Wandersee and Schussler, based on a whole series of behavioral studies, found that students preferred studying animals over plants. This was in surveys where they asked, are you more interested in studying animals or plants? Then when participants were presented with images in rapid succession and asked, for example, with the two photos at the top, what they saw, people were more likely to say that they saw a butterfly rather than a zinnia, or that they saw the elephant rather than the big sausage tree that the elephant was standing beneath. So individuals are more likely to detect animals than plants when shown photos. When they gave the study participants control over forwarding through images and then measured how long people lingered over particular images, they found that study participants' attention was captured for longer periods of time by animals rather than by images of plants. And then when they presented participants with lists of common names for both plants and animals, and then remove those lists from in front of the participants and ask them which names they remembered, the participants recalled many more animal names than plant names. So taken all together, these series of behavioral studies informed the development of the theory of plant blindness, which Wandersee and Schussler defined as the failure to see or notice the plants in one's own environment, which leads to an inability to recognize the importance of plants in the biosphere and in human affairs, inability to appreciate the aesthetic and unique biological features of plants, and the ranking of plants as inferior to animals, leading to the conclusion that they're not worthy of human consideration. Now, Wandersee and Schussler picked that name, that metaphor of blindness, because it is widely used in American culture in idioms such as blind date, blind drunk, blind alley, blind landing, blind chance, and so on, that the critical piece of information here is that metaphor of blindness referring to a lack of visual information. However, there have been some subsequent publications, particularly by an author named Catherine Parsley, who's noted that the term blindness, or particularly plant blindness, equates the disability of blindness with a negative trait or perception. And she has suggested an alternate term for this, which is plant awareness disparity, or PAD. And so you may actually see either name in the literature. I still believe that plant blindness is widely used, and plant awareness disparity has not really come into favor in terms of an alternate term. So for now, I'm still using the term plant blindness. So then the question is, if there is this inability to see plants in the world around us and understand their importance, what really causes this? The original idea of Wandersee and Schuster was that this was really a product of our education system, and that the people who were developing our primary and secondary school curricula had a zoological bias and were zoologically focused. But what happened is, when Wandersee and Schuster really started digging into the literature, they found that there's a whole number of factors in how our eyes and minds work, that is, in visual perception and cognition, and that many of these are actually hardwired in humans as a result of evolutionary processes. So, I'm going to spend some time talking about some of those factors that Wandersee and Schuster take note of in some of their preliminary publications on plant blindness. So the assumption is that our eyes function as cameras, and everything that we see is registered by our minds, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. There's been a whole bunch of visual and cognitive studies that have showed that our eyes are picking up as much as 10 to 12 million bits of information per second. So our eyes are just taking in a very, very large quantity of information, but only about a 40 to 60 bits of information are actually entering our conscious mind. So the ability of our eyes to take in is far greater than the ability of our cognitive process to actually register and be conscious of things. There's also something called signal value, which says that we're much more likely to see, pay attention to, and ascribe importance to things that we already know and understand. So we are less likely to see things that we don't know as well. And since we humans are animals, we tend to often be focused on other animals. Then there's a background effect. Plants in general have a fairly homogeneous appearance, particularly when they're not in flower or fruit. They've got a green color and overall similarity in form. They are mostly immobile and an absence of faces. And when you're talking about the development of human vision and cognition, one of the really critical features that plays into that early stages of human cognition is faces. You guys know, if you've interacted with very young babies, that some of the first things they react to, you're leaning over that crib and you make a face at them, and then all of a sudden their eyes light up and they register. So an absence of faces in plants is definitely thought to influence that background effect. Then there's the proximity principle. Because plants do grow together, we tend to see them as a mass. This is adaptive for plants because when they're growing in a mass, it actually decreases the herbivory pressure on any one individual. So we have this idiom that you can't see the forest for the trees, but actually the opposite is true. We're much more likely to see the mass, the forest, rather than the individual plants that make up the forest. Then there's also been quite a bit of information about consciousness and perception as it relates to threat. Plants are not thought to offer nearly as much a threat to humans as animals like lions and tigers and bears. Because they are ubiquitous in the environment, they're considered quite common, and this leads to diminished conscious attention to plants. And then lastly, the things that really structure our visual experiences are space, or particularly movement through space, time or changes over time, and color. And it's thought that plants offer fewer time, space, and color-based visual cues than animals. In addition to those visual and cognitive factors, there's also a whole number of societal factors that are thought to contribute to plant blindness. These include an increasingly urbanized population, fewer individuals being involved in agricultural production or living off the land, so that they're less accustomed to plants in their environment, they're less dependent on plants, and they're less aware of the signals that the plants are giving in terms of what's going on in the environment. As you all know, we've got an enormous level of digital distraction. So between our handheld devices, our phones or our tablets, and our desktop screens, there's just an infinite amount of digital distraction, which often takes our eyes and our attention off the natural environment. And then, of course, there's just the whole phenomenon of information overload, that because there are so many sources of information available 24/7, it's not just, when the morning newspaper arrives and when the news is broadcast at 6 p.m., but an infinite, never-ending stream of both news and cultural ephemera that is coming at us through our devices 24/7. And so information overload can lead to a lack of attention to the environment around us. So revisiting this idea of nature versus nurture as it relates to plant blindness, it appears that both really play a role, that there are a number of natural cognitive and visual factors that contribute to plant blindness, as well as a number of learned social or societal factors. Now, plant blindness is really part of a broader issue of a waning scientific literacy. So people are more intimidated by science and less likely to think that science is necessarily of direct relevance to their day-to-day lives. Among Western, particularly urbanized Western populations, there's also a tendency to view ourselves as separate from nature rather than being a part of and dependent on nature. And then it's thought that plant blindness develops at a young age and is really reinforced by the dominance of animals over plants in a whole different array of spheres, including sports teams and team mascots. So I had to dig really hard to find some plant-related sports mascots like the Ohio State Fighting Buckeyes or the Delta State Fighting Okra down in the lower left. But the overwhelming number of team mascots, both at a professional and amateur level, are animals. Of course, the same is true of cartoon characters. The overwhelming majority of cartoon characters stuffed animals, shaped candies, characters in children's songs and games. It's all animal dominated. So the BBC published an article in 2016 based on a survey that was done actually by Unilever, the big corporate company that makes a number of detergents. And Unilever found that 75% of the children aged 5 to 12 in the United Kingdom spend less time outside than prisoners. And the reason for that is because in many prison systems, both in the United States and in Europe, there is a required prison yard time where the prisoners are required to be outdoors, and we don't have that with children. So I thought that was a pretty shocking statistic. So now that we know what plant blindness is and some of the factors that contribute to it, what are the implications of this? So first and foremost is reduced funding for plant conservation. And I'll give some more specific figures in just a minute, but just know that plants receive much less funding for conservation than animals do. There's also a discrepancy in the protection for federally endangered plants versus animals in the United States. So you may not be aware that in the US, federally endangered animals are protected on both private land and public land. Whereas for federally endangered plants, they are only protected on public land, but not on private land. And this is despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of endangered plants actually occur on private land, but they're not protected on that private land. So that's a big discrepancy in federal protection. Another implication of plant blindness is an emphasis on development and the importance or progress of development over the preservation of green spaces and particularly tree canopy. There's also a lack of understanding of the basic aspects of plant growth, leading to destructive landscape practices. And I'm sure many of you as extension agents encounter this all the time, where we have clients who fail to understand that doing something like massive pruning on a crepe myrtle tree may ultimately be detrimental to the long-term health of that tree. So lots of destructive landscape practices resulting from a lack of understanding of basic aspects of plant biology. There's also a tendency to think of plants as purely decorative rather than functional. So a lot of times people will purchase plants for their home or landscape, but they'll view them as an aesthetic accoutrement and not pay attention to whether it's really the right plant for the right place and if it is going to thrive and do well in the location where they're putting it. There's also a tendency to perceive risk rather than value in plants, particularly when it comes to trees. You'll find many homeowners, particularly in hurricane-prone areas, where they'll say, I don't want that tree near my house, because they perceive that there is a risk to that tree falling on their house, rather than perceiving the potential value of having that tree near their house in terms of reducing heating and cooling costs, providing more shade, and so on. There's a tendency to overlook or underemphasize plants when teaching biology, and this is reflected by an underrepresentation of botany in our federal and state guidelines for biology teachers. So in general, when you are training to become a biology teacher in the United States, you are much more likely to receive additional coursework involving zoology and ecology than you are botany. It is rare to find a biology teacher who has had multiple courses in plant science. As a result, we're seeing a decline in university botanical degree programs and courses. So in higher education institutions across the United States, we're seeing a coalescence of plant-related programs. So instead of having separate departments in agronomy, environmental horticulture, hort science, and so on, you may have a unified plant sciences program, or in some cases, like here at the University of Florida, we no longer have a separate botany department, but botany has been merged in with zoology, and we now have a general UF biology department, but not a botany department. This leads to fewer individuals pursuing careers in plant science. And then with fewer people pursuing careers, it means that federal agencies that manage our public lands, such as the Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management, cannot find enough trained individuals to deal with and handle land management issues. So there was a very interesting article that came out in 2014, which examined the patterns of expenditure for plant conservation under the Endangered Species Act. And it found that in the US, about 31% of the native plant species are at risk of extinction, and about 11% are so endangered that they are protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So about a third of our native plant species at risk and a little more than 10% protected under legislation. Now, plants account for about 57% of all the species on the Federal Endangered Species List, but they just receive 4% of the endangered expenditures from the Fish and Wildlife Service and its federal partner agencies. So even though plants account for the majority of the species that are endangered, they receive the smallest share of the funding for conservation. An interesting article on plant blindness that came out in the Wall Street Journal in 2018, based on survey with various land management agencies, said that there is now only one botanist on the federal payroll for every 20 million acres of public land in the country, which I think is a pretty mind-blowing statistic. Okay, so let's talk about why plants matter. I really like this illustration because it's kind of a graphic representation of plants as the lungs of the planet. There are, in fact, a whole slew of environmental, economic, and health and psychosocial benefits that we derive from plants, and I'd like to talk about each of those categories very briefly. So in terms of environmental benefits, plants, of course, create the oxygenated atmosphere that we rely on and that allow us to survive on this planet. Furthermore, plants form the foundation of the food chain or trophic system, so all other trophic levels are dependent on plants. Plants, of course, shape both our local and regional weather patterns, and when there is massive deforestation, often results in very significant changes to those weather patterns. Plants, of course, provide habitat for animal life. They build soil fertility and reduce soil erosion. Plants reduce stormwater runoff. And of course, and very importantly, in this day and age, plants sequester carbon dioxide, which is the principal greenhouse gas responsible for climate change and global warming. In addition, plants remove pollutants from the soil, the water, and the air. And with these last two factors of sequestering carbon dioxide and pollutants in soil, water, and air, these are really issues that man has greatly exacerbated, humans have exacerbated. And so I like to think of it that plants are saving us from ourselves by sequestering carbon dioxide and removing these toxins from our environment. In terms of economic benefits, of course, plants are a fundamental source of food, fiber, shelter, particularly in the form of wood, medicine, and fuel. Florida's green industry, and this presentation was really geared towards a Florida audience, generates about $31.4 billion in total annual sales and provides more than 250,000 jobs, making it the second largest segment of the state's economy. Properly selected and placed plants can lower home heating and cooling costs by up to 25%. Landscaping and proximity to green space increase property resale values. And plants are thought to be the fastest and most cost-effective means for changing negative perceptions of a particular neighborhood or area, thereby improving economic and social conditions. When the New York City Parks Department measured the economic impact of its trees, and they looked at those benefits, they totaled to about $120 million a year. This included energy savings, air quality improvements, and cost of mitigating stormwater. So massive savings derived from plants in the urban landscape, which vastly surpass the actual budget of the Parks Department itself. And then lastly, let's not forget about the health and psychosocial benefits of plants. Of course, green spaces encourage us to get outdoors and get more physical activity. It's been found that women 50 and older who garden at least once a week had higher bone density than those who jogged, walked, swam, or did aerobics. Tree cover is strongly linked to student academic performance. So in schools that have windows that look out on green space versus looking out on a sterile or urban environment, the students performed better on academic tests. Trees and green spaces are positively correlated with improved mental health, reducing negative thoughts and symptoms of depression while improving mood and self-reported life satisfaction. There's been a whole series of interesting studies on how the addition of green spaces and trees can reduce crime rates in inner city public housing areas. And then views of and access to green space have been demonstrated to speed the recovery of hospital patients. So people who have spaces or access to green spaces while in the hospital are going to recover and get out of the hospital more quickly. And then workers with views of green spaces reported more satisfaction and less job stress than those who did not have access to green space. So this begs the question, if plants are so essential for our environmental, economic, physical, and mental well-being, what can we do to reduce the impacts of plant blindness? So Wandersee and Schuster really emphasize the importance of mentorship. And specifically, what they say is that early exposure under the guidance of a friendly and knowledgeable adult is a fantastic predictor of that child's later attention to, interest, and understanding of plants. And what's more, when that child grows up and has children of his or her own, they are much more likely to inform their children about plants and share that interest of plants with their children. So mentorship at an early age has a transgenerational impact. So really what Wandersee and Schuss are advocating is early, repeated, and strategic plant education coupled with a whole series of guided experiences such as gardening activities, nature walks, or kitchen windowsill experiments. So you can see an example here in the image on the upper right where they're actually doing a little seed germination experiment in Ziploc bags, where each kid was able to sow some seeds in a Ziploc bag and then tape them up on the wall and then note the progress. And even though this wouldn't result in long-term health and growth of the plants, it was a great way for the kids to actually observe that process of germination and growth. And this is one of those ways you can get kids starting to pay attention and really notice what's going on with plants. The idea is that the greater a value a particular culture ascribes to plants, the more likely people are to pursue careers working with plants, which in turn will then help to reduce plant blindness. And there's a whole series of activist approaches so we can reach educators, parents, and students using posters, children's books featuring plants, changes in the curricula for science teachers, and revision of the guidelines for biology teachers to increase botanical coursework. All of this will help to address plant blindness. Balding and Williams argue that strategies that make people aware of how much humans actually have in common with plants will make people have more empathy for plants and therefore be more supportive of plant conservation. So instead of thinking of animals as being very different from plants, looking at the things that show shared similarities and behaviors in terms of biology between plants and animals, and the degree to which plants influence animals and the behavior all help to create that improved empathy and therefore improved support for plant conservation. A survey at the Vienna Botanical Garden on plant blindness indicated that amongst adult visitors, the adults were much more likely to pay attention and be engaged by information about plants that were relevant to people. So those were plants that were edible, medicinal, used as culinary spices and herbs. Those generated much more interest than just general plant science modules. So what we need to do is find ways to educate on the implications and broader impacts of plant extinctions. That is, what would our world actually be like if we were living without plants? How would it impact our environment, our climate, the diversity of animals around us? However, a doomsday type scenario is usually not very effective in making people aware of plants or changing the behavior with regard to endangered plants. So instead, what we need are strategies that make people aware of why and how it is important to conserve plants. And really, rather than focusing on conserving individual plant species, we need to think about preserving ecosystems and habitats, that is, preserving plants as part of the environment that they support. Now, in this day and age, a lot of these efforts need to happen where people are, which is primarily on their digital devices. So we need to incorporate novel strategies that make people pay more attention. So there's plenty of apps that people can use on their phone to identify plants, but how many apps are there really that make people think about plants and the roles that plants actually play in their day-to-day lives? So we need to develop more digital educational approaches and visual approaches that make people look twice and think. So I really like this artist named Jonas Luce, who's doing a bunch of artwork featuring crazy things like slices of pizza and ice cream cones growing on plants, because then you can use this as a jumping off point when you're talking with individuals about, like, does pizza or ice cream grow on trees? Where does food come from? What is this pizza made out of? And so on, and start to relate the pizza crust, to example, to the flour that is derived from the plant. What can we do as individuals? So first and foremost, share your knowledge of and enthusiasm for plants. We tend to often be very focused in doing adult outreach and education with our extension programs, but more contact with youth definitely is going to have a broader transgenerational impact. Get involved with school gardens or after school programs. Become a plant mentor for children in your sphere, whether they are grandchildren, nieces, nephews, neighbor children. Share your enthusiasm and your passion for botany with children. Help to develop public green spaces and community gardens where individuals can learn to appreciate and understand plants. And then lastly, support equal protection for plants under the Federal Endangered Species Act, so that plants are protected on public lands as well as private lands. And with that, I will be happy to take questions if there is time.
Great, and people can put any questions into the chat, or you're welcome to unmute also and ask questions.
Thank you, Alyssa. Yes, this Brianna is asking about will the recording be available later? My understanding is yes, that Ashley and Anne are recording this and we'll post it to YouTube.
Yep, and I'll share that link on the next slide so that everybody has that that link. Looks like Linda has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation, Mark. I just wanted to say an interesting effect that introducing my stepdaughter to plants had was that she ended up going into FFA horticulture in high school and got a scholarship to college through that program. So that was a really great side effect from taking her on walks and pointing out plants.
That's great. That's fantastic. And, you know, I've found anecdotally in just talking, of course, plant people surround themselves with plant people. So then when I talk to my plant people and I say, you know, did you grow up around plants? Like, did your folks garden? Did your mom keep house plants? Did your grandma keep house plants? That the people who are plant people today often developed that interest or at least that exposure at a younger age, and then it took off as they got older. Okay, let me see if I can catch up with some of this in chat. Emily Morrison's asking, what are some ways to connect? Oh, it just shifted. Where did it go?
You want me to read those to you? I can find them.
Yeah, you
Okay.
got them?
Yep.
Thank you, Anne.
She asked, what are some ways to connect an average person with no science background to start to be less plant blind?
You know, I always think with most of us, not everyone, food is a great entry point. A vegetable garden or orchard, you know, you want to get someone interested in plants through their stomach is a fantastic way. Art projects are another way. So utilizing plants, dried flowers, plant parts as parts of art projects. You know, there's a whole series of different ways that you can engage people, but what you have to assume is that people may not enter this with a particular interest or affinity for plants, but sometimes by introducing something else like something delicious to eat or something creative, then it kind of sparks their interest and they're more likely to then pursue it further. Sharon,
Okay.
you've got your hand raised. Would you like to go ahead and unmute?
I'm sure I just put my question in the chat just in case, but I was just curious if you could point to any studies that show some connection between whether it be an extension program in gardening or school gardens and further study, further research in plant science.
I'm not aware of any. But I'm sure there is. I had actually put this presentation together for Master Gardeners, and my motivation in it was first to just get Master Gardeners thinking about it, because Master Gardeners as a whole are a very plant-focused group. And so I wanted to introduce to them the idea that there actually is a large segment of the population that doesn't pay any attention to plants at all. And just because they're so important to us doesn't mean that our clientele necessarily has any prior knowledge or interest in plants. So that was one goal of putting this together. The second goal was really to start motivating more Master Gardeners to be involved in youth programming, because I feel like the youth programming is the primary way to address some of these issues of people growing up and not seeing and appreciating plants. Yes, Brianna, your hand's raised. Would you like to unmute or put some in chat?
Sure. I did want to build on what you were saying right there about the impact of youth. I take care of many of the incoming Master Gardener beginner intern volunteers, new volunteers.
Mhm.
And, I'm here in Minnesota. And what I hear from every single one of them is a background story about some important person in their life who, I'm going to say, quote, forced them to do garden stuff. And here they are 30, 40, 50, 60 years later as a Master Gardener, but they all attribute that one moment picking raspberries or green beans or snap shelling. They all attribute it right back to, I'm here because of that one summer.
And I can't agree more. That's definitely my experience with all of the master gardeners and the individuals that I interact with who tell me that that their interest in plants stems to some mentorship experience as a child.
Okay, Mark, one of the questions in the chat from Laura is, do you find that in more recent times, plant blindness is more prevalent than in like the 1950s or earlier?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you of any literature that supports that, but when you look at the proportion of the population in this country that lived in rural areas versus urban areas, and the number of people who are involved in agricultural production 70 years ago versus now in 2024, you know that the number of people who are living off of and dependent on the land is much lower, coupled with the fact that we do have such a higher level of digital distraction and information overload. So I definitely feel that plant blindness is a symptom of our modern age.
Definitely. Okay, one more question from the
Can I
chat.
make a comment on that too? Because this is Anne.
Sure.
After I heard your talk for the first time, I was very inspired to get my master gardeners to really focus more on youth gardening, because many of them don't really want to work with kids, which is kind of frustrating. But I thought all of this was super motivating to get them to see why it is so important. And we started offering a summer camp that was focused on plants and nature and getting kids outside. And there is some data out there that does talk about wellness benefits, physical, mental benefits of kids getting off devices and being inside and going outside and just feeling comfortable to be outside, comfortable touching plants, all of those things that seem pretty basic. And, I found this really helpful to encourage master gardeners because they had a grandparent or someone that got them interested in gardening, and telling them that they could be that mentor for the kids that maybe don't have parents to do that for them. So maybe this will help everyone else in their county programs do something similar.
So do we have time to address any more of the questions in chat?
Yeah, we still have 5 minutes if we want to keep
Okay,
going.
Ollie Schneiderman is asking, says, I'm curious about how to both present the seriousness, importance of plant conservation without making it doomsday. I guess, what is the line between presenting the serious situation and the doomsday? So I agree 100%. We gotta communicate the seriousness of the situation, but I think the tack to take is one of reliance and interdependence between species, and that we as humans in so many different ways are very dependent on all of the biological diversity around us, and that plants are foundational to that. So I think a tact that talks about the interconnectedness of things is probably a good way to avoid that like doomsday scenario. Brianna had asked about the need for something beyond ID apps to engage the public. And what would that be? Do I know anyone who is doing anything in this direction? And so in terms of apps that are coming out of extension, perhaps not so much. I mean, I know I've seen some plant toxicity apps that that people can use to ID plants, but then find out information about the level of toxicity. but I like what's happening in some of our public gardens around the country where they're using RFID or some other technology where individuals can actually access information about plants in a whole realm of spheres. So it might be distributional information, it might be ecological information, it might be information about the individual biology of that species, pollinator interactions, and so on. So I feel like there is a lot of potential for developing apps that go beyond just the simple, what is this plant? Rebecca's echoing something similar, saying she really loves the iNaturalist app and she feels like it goes beyond the AI plant ID and kind of gets people more engaged.
All right, did we miss any questions in the chat? I don't think so.
I think most of them are just comments that are left, but really good for people to read through.
Mhm.
This has
Great.
been great.
Yeah, and
I
so
just want to mention that Brianna's saying something about houseplant donation events. And I have to say, another talk I do is about the renaissance of interest in houseplants. And it has had a tremendous effect in getting more young people, particularly millennials, interested in and engaged with plants through their homes. So they might not be as interested in outdoor garden activities, but they're definitely self-identifying as plant crazy because of houseplants. So houseplants are a great entry point, a launching point to get people more interested in plants as a whole.
all right, thanks, Mark. And I just put up the link to the YouTube where we'll get this posted. I think a lot of people may want to share this with colleagues as well. So there is the link for the YouTube. I'll send out an email and let everybody know when we have everything posted as well. And I'll let everyone know through the next eBlast what we have coming up. Remember, you can sign up for the eBlast. It goes out nationwide to all Extension Master Gardener coordinators, and it has more announcements than just the webinars, obviously, but we do try to put ours in there. And then, of course, save the dates for the rest of the 2024 webinars. And I think this was a good start. We have a lot more interesting stuff to come. We appreciate Marc being with us today and sharing about plant blindness. I hope it inspires you all to do some more programming in your communities. And just a reminder what we have coming up in April. And we thank everyone for attending today.